Emily's camping trip with her friends had started out as a fun adventure. They had spent the day hiking and exploring the woods, taking in the beauty of the trees and the wildlife. But as night fell, Emily found herself separated from the group, lost in the woods. The darkness was all-encompassing, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of her. The only sound she could hear was the crunching of leaves and twigs under her feet as she stumbled around, trying to find her way back to camp. But the woods seemed to be closing in on her, the trees looming like twisted fingers reaching out to grab her. Emily's heart raced as she heard rustling in the bushes. She tried to stay calm and still, hoping it was just an animal. But as she turned to run, she stumbled over a root and fell to the ground. Her flashlight flickered and went out, leaving her in complete darkness. She struggled to stand up, her heart pounding in her chest. The rustling grew closer and she could hear something breathing heavily. Emily closed her eyes and tried to slow her breathing, praying for a miracle. As the breathing grew louder, Emily's fear turned to terror. She could feel the breath on her face and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Suddenly, she heard a voice whispering in her ear. "Are you lost, little one?" Emily's heart skipped a beat as she opened her eyes. In front of her was a shadowy figure, barely visible in the darkness. It had piercing eyes that glowed in the night, and long, gnarled fingers that seemed to reach out to grab her. She tried to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. The figure chuckled softly and stepped closer, its breath hot on her face. Emily's heart raced as she heard footsteps approaching her. Suddenly she heard a voice calling her name. She turned and saw her friends running towards her. They had been looking for her all night and finally stumbled upon her by chance. The figure disappeared into the darkness as Emily's friends reached her. She hugged them tightly, tears streaming down her face. She was safe and finally out of the woods. As they walked back to the campsite, Emily explained how she got separated from the group. Her friends were shocked at the story of the shadowy figure and tried to calm her down. But Emily couldn't shake off the feeling that something was still out there, lurking in the darkness. From that day on, Emily made sure to always stick with her friends on camping trips. She never wanted to experience the fear and loneliness of being lost in the woods at night again. But even though she was safe now, the memory of the shadowy figure haunted her. She couldn't shake off the feeling that it was still out there waiting for her, and she knew that the next time she ventured into the woods, she would never let her guard down. It was a dark and moonless night, and James found himself lost in the woods. He had wandered too far from his campsite, and now the forest seemed to be closing in on him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps and the rustling of leaves under his feet. Suddenly James heard a faint whispering sound. He stopped and strained his ears, trying to make out what it was saying. The whispering grew louder, and James realized that it was coming from all around him. He tried to ignore the whispers and continue on his way, but the sound grew louder and more insistent. The whispers seemed to be trying to communicate with him, but the words were muddled and incomprehensible. As he stumbled through the woods, James realized that the trees were shifting and moving around him. They seemed to be alive, reaching out with their branches and trying to grab him. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he realized that he was not alone in the woods. The whispers grew louder and more menacing, and James began to panic. He tried to run, but the trees seemed to be blocking his way. The whispering turned into an eerie chanting, and James felt as if he was being pulled into a trance. He stumbled upon a clearing and found a group of hooded figures standing in a circle, their faces hidden in the shadows. They were chanting in a language that James didn't recognize, and he felt a sense of dread creeping up his spine. He tried to turn back, but the trees seemed to have closed in behind him, trapping him in the clearing. The chanting grew louder, and the hooded figures began to move towards him. James tried to scream, but his voice was caught in his throat. He felt a pair of cold hands wrap around his neck, squeezing the air out of his lungs. He struggled to break free, but the hands were too strong. Just as he was about to pass out, the chanting stopped and the hands released him. James stumbled backward, gasping for breath. He looked up and saw that the hooded figures were gone, and the trees had returned to their normal positions. He ran back to his campsite, terrified and shaken. He never spoke of the incident again, but he could never forget the feeling of being trapped in the whispering woods. From that day on, he never ventured too far from his campsite at night, always staying close to the light and the safety of his fire. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the forest, Jack knew he was lost. He had gone on a hike earlier in the day, but now he couldn't remember the way back to his car. His phone battery had died hours ago, and he had no flashlight. As he stumbled through the darkness, Jack heard a rustling in the bushes. He froze, his heart racing. He listened, but there was only silence. He shrugged it off and continued walking, but the rustling continued, growing louder and more persistent. Jack felt like he was being watched. He turned around, but there was no one there. He quickened his pace, his senses on high alert. He felt like he was being followed, but every time he turned around, there was no one in sight. As he walked, Jack saw two glowing eyes in the distance. They seemed to be following him, watching him. Jack picked up his pace, his heart racing with fear. The eyes drew closer and closer, until Jack could see a shadowy figure looming in the darkness. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. But there was something off about him, something sinister. Jack tried to run, but the figure was too fast. It chased him through the woods, its eyes glowing with a hypnotic power. Jack felt like he was going to collapse. His legs were burning and his heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. He stumbled and fell, hitting his head on a rock. His vision blurred and he felt like he was drifting away. When he opened his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure standing over him, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Jack tried to move, but he was paralyzed. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. The figure reached down and grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground. Jack struggled, trying to break free, but the figure was too strong. Its grip tightened, and Jack felt like he was suffocating. He saw stars flashing before his eyes, and he knew that he was going to die. Just then, a beam of light shone through the trees, illuminating the figure. It hissed and dropped Jack, disappearing into the darkness. Jack lay there, gasping for air as the light grew brighter and brighter. Finally, a group of search and rescue volunteers appeared, their flashlights piercing the darkness. They helped Jack to his feet and led him back to their campsite. Jack was safe, but he knew that he would never forget the terror of being chased by those glowing eyes in the shadows, and the fear of never making it out alive. Thanks for watching today's video. Please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. It really helps us out, and until next time, stay safe and never wander too far from the light.